Hi, I'm Roger. Welcome to my shop. It's quite a bit of a mess. Highly disorganized. Our e-commerce business has been so busy that my table saw, which is my primary work surface, is piled up with all kinds of stuff because, as I've mentioned before, if there's a flat surface, I'll find something to lay on it. At any rate, this next set of videos I'm going to be doing will cover the rebuild of a 1988 SunTracker DL28 party hut pontoon boat. We bought this back in the early 2000s. We bought it used, it being in 1988. And there is quite the story that goes with it. We used it for a few years. Then coming up in 2016, decided it was time to do a rebuild because the floor had problems, and the console where I would sit to operate, I had to keep one hand on the controller and the other hand on the console because the bottom had pretty much rotted off and it was just getting bad overall. So this will be a multi-part video on different phases that we've gone through. We started the rebuild in June of 2016, and I believe we had it back in the water by August. I wasn't retired then, I was still working full-time, so the only time to really work on it was obviously on weekends, and then if I had any free time during the week at night. So what we have here in this first part is going to cover the demolition and what I found. Back when we did this, I had no thoughts of making videos or anything like that, so this will be somewhat of a slideshow as we get down to the final parts with stuff that we're doing this year and modifications and upgrades and things. Then it'll be more of a live video. But otherwise, take on a project like this requires a lot of skills. Obviously, you have to have woodworking skills. I'm pretty good at that. Electrical skills, well, that was my trade for over 40 years, so that was no problem. You also have to know how to weld and upholster, which we'll get into because I had to learn how to sew through this whole process and do a little horse trading to get an industrial machine. And yeah, there's quite a bit to it. We'll get down to the fiasco we had to go through with rebuilding the trailer because of the way it was originally constructed. So yeah, this was quite the adventure, and like as I said, a lot of it will be a slideshow, but I'll have a narration to go with it. And I hope you enjoy them. Okay, here's a story of part one. As you can see here, this is as we had been using it for quite some time, and before we started on it on the 6th of June of 2015. The grill we have sitting in the front there, that's that red thing. It's called a tailgater. We used to just leave that folded down and move it around as we needed it. The anchor and the ropes would just lay on the in front of the gate on the front playpen. Had a little table up there on the starboard side. And if you're not familiar with nautical terms, starboard is right, port is left, and an easy way to remember that is port has 4 letters, and so does the word left. 4 is forward, of course, and then aft is the rear. What we're looking at here, this is as it was sitting at the dock back then, and if you look up here where I'm got my little cursor moving around, you can see that the vinyl was coming apart on the walls right there. What this was a vinyl covering over some type of thin particle board, and then that was over the top of styrofoam. Wasn't not a good combination in a damp location. We also had the same thing happening on the sides of the walls in the back there. This little area right here is where the bathroom is, or in nautical terms is called the head. And back over here, in this little corner is, it's called the galley or the kitchen. And there was a sink and a alcohol stove, which we never used, so we didn't put the alcohol stove back in. Below that was a ice box and a storage cabinet. So the first thing to do was take this out of the water and see what all we had to do with it. This is up in the boatyard at the campground where we stay, and you can look down the side there and see that the outer base rails, we had taken them off because so many of the bolts had pulled through the plywood that we were afraid we'd lose them into the river. This is a view from the other side, and that's a little bit of my grandson helping us clean some stuff up before we took it up to my son-in-law's shop to work on it. Here's an idea of why we were replacing the floor and why we were rebuilding everything. The floor was just turning into crumbles. So, wheel this on the trailer up to the son-in-law's shop. Of course, the first thing you have to do is take everything apart. That meant the roof would have to be taken off, and as you can see here, we have a forklift out there. Everything's been unbolted on the roof section, and the son-in-law is about to lift the roof off, and we'll set that on the ground. Everything was labeled according to which poles went where and what bolts came out of what, because there was a lot of nuts and bolts and hardware and aluminum brackets and so on. This is, as I'd mentioned in the beginning of this is the base of the console, and as I would shift and drive and stuff, I would have to hold on to the console with one hand and then the controls with the other, because the base of the console had just flat rotted off. We also had a problem with some of the seats where the bottom of them had deteriorated to the point where they just weren't held to the floor anymore. This is one of the seats that's been turned up on end, and you can see everything was just rotted apart. This is a little bit of a view of the shifter, as you will. It was mounted to the side of the console. This did get replaced with a new one. One of the problems we had was you could go from neutral to forward. You could go from neutral to reverse. But if you want to go from reverse to neutral, you wouldn't get that. It'd go right into forward. And you better be hanging on when that happened. This is the back of the instrument cluster. There had been a lot of things done over time. I just cut everything off, and I'll rewire everything. We'll start over, and you'll see that later on in other parts of these videos. Here's the console after it was stripped of the old vinyl and carpet. You can see where the bottom had all been just falling apart. I did reuse a little bit of this in the rebuild, and something else you'll see in the rebuild, that it is quite a bit deeper now, or width-wise, or depth. What I decided to do was, instead of just having one battery for the entire boat, is have one battery in the back strictly for the engine, then have two size 27 batteries underneath this console for house power, and have a place to store a few things as well. And you'll see that in the future parts of the build. Okay, we got everything off, got the fences off, and all the seats out, and the walls down, and this is what you're left with. We still have to take the little upper part of the back off. Those little square aluminum brackets you see back there actually hold up a piece of carpet or plywood that can be slid up and out and laid across the rear seats, and then the rear cushion folds out and it becomes a bed. We were wondering how hard it was going to be to get all that nasty rotted plywood off, but we found out that if we stood on one side and gave it a sharp jerk up, the screws just pulled right through. Of course, we had to go back through then with a angle grinder and cut what was left of all those screws off. What we're using with the new decking, and you'll see that in part 2, is a type of treated plywood that's made to go onto aluminum frame without creating any type of corrosion. The conventional treated plywood you would get at the home store or the lumber yard has a copper treatment in it, which will have a galvanic reaction with the aluminum, and it will corrode. We also used all stainless steel fasteners, as you'll see in the next part. So here it is. Everything's all stripped off, right down to the bare frame. Still left the motor on in the back, and that's something else I did a little bit of work with. You see the motor cover is kind of a white and black. Well, that white is actually just the fiberglass where all the black paint had peeled off. So that got refinished, but you'll see that in one of the future parts. Okay, I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this rebuild video. Obviously, it's just a demolition part and getting everything taken down to the bare frame. Coming up in part 2, I'll be going through the process of getting the deck back on and how we rebuilt the walls using some powder coat aluminum sheet that was actually intended for race cars. There was a local source here, so we took advantage of that. No, it wasn't cheap, but you'll see on that in the next video. Of course, if you like this or you got something out of it, we always appreciate getting a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more, you can hit that subscribe button And if you hit that little bell over there on the right hand side of the subscribe, you'll be notified when we post another video. Thanks for watching.